Welcome to this session for our distance training topic. This topic is going to cover our OSHA annual refresher training for our Bloodborne Pathogens and Hazardous Communication, or also known as HazComm. This session is going to slightly differ than our past sessions where you review the presentation. It's pretty much going to be a video overlay with the presentation, followed up with a test on FireManager, very similar to what we've done in the past. With the presentation, we're going to cover again the two topics of Bloodborne Pathogens and Hazardous Communications in one. Start off with Bloodborne and go straight into HazComm. With these, we're going to cover our particular fire department policy procedures that also mirror or use the policy procedures of North Carolina Department of Labor, or OSHA, to set forth our requirements. There is some reference material where this information is pulled from. The North Carolina Department of Labor does have a guide to bloodborne pathogens in the workplace. We'll talk more about that here in details as far as workplace to workplace, department to department, and along with that, volunteer service organizations. I'm often asked or informed that certain volunteer agencies don't have to follow this standard because they're a volunteer organization versus a paid, where we don't fall in that category, being a paid system. The way OSHA North Carolina looks at it is if an agency has one paid person, that agency has to follow the OSHA standard with bloodborne pathogens. And overall, even if it's an all-volunteer system, typically the benefits of that agency through their insurance provider also require certain adherence to policies and procedures set forth by either OSHA or other regulatory standards. The Department of Labor standard, or OSHA standard for bloodborne pathogens, is listed there, 1910.1030. So with the Bloodborne Course Objectives, we're going to briefly discuss or review what the actual bloodborne pathogens are. It doesn't matter if you're on Clayton Fire Department or Los Angeles Fire Department. A bloodborne pathogen is a bloodborne pathogen. So we're going to just real quick review what they are, and we're going to talk about why they're harmful. And then probably the most important part is how can you protect yourself, and what is your exposure control plan per your policies. So with that, let's kind of provide some little realism. We're going to look at a case study. This is an actual event that happened, not specifically with Clayton Fire Department, but it did happen at a fire department here in our area, and we also removed some of the names and slightly modified the information as to not interfere with anything or violate anybody's processes or departmental procedures. But imagine, if you will, you respond to a motor vehicle accident. You got a patient pinned in the front passenger seat. This patient was not wearing a seat belt, therefore there's some hair, some blood, and some other bodily type matter noted in the windshield area where their head struck the windshield. During the extrication process, as is normal with a pin in, we do remove the front windshield. This was done by using a glass master, which leaves your jagged edges along the windshield area. When the last cut was done, firefighter reached up and assisted with removing the windshield from the vehicle and felt a sharp pain in his right hand, in his palm area to be exact. The firefighter was wearing his full protective equipment, including extrication gloves, and as he removed his gloves to find out what the sharp pain was, he notes there's a cut across his right palm area. When he looked at his gloves, examined his gloves, he noted there was a damaged section of the glove in the palm area, and there was also blood on the glove, possibly from the transfer from the windshield. It's not necessarily known if the damage on the glove was prior to the accident, but regardless, there was a cut through the glove of the hand. So a few questions here, and you're more than free to look at these questions now. Pause. If you're doing this presentation with a group of people, you can discuss amongst yourself what you think it is. We will discuss the answers at the end of the presentation. But with bloodborne pathogens, hopefully you can answer these, or if you don't know them right off the top of your head, you should at least know where to go to get the information to answer these questions. So, was it an exposure? What are the immediate actions? What contacts need to be made? Who do you need to contact per departmental policy? What kind of documentation needs to be done? And what are some recommended actions to prevent this from happening again? As I mentioned in the reference material, there's other information out there that's regarding bloodborne pathogens. North Carolina Department of Labor did compile a list of frequently asked questions. You're more than welcome to pull those up if you want to look at them online. There's various ones from the who has to follow this, what some of the procedures are with certain testing, which we're going to cover a lot of these frequently asked questions in the presentation. The one that I get often asked is, can one agency's bloodborne pathogen training count for another agency's? The OSHA answer to that is no. The reason for that is the policies and procedures that are in place. So if you're taking this presentation here at Clayton Fire Department and plan to use this training credits for said other fire department that you may volunteer for or whatnot, if they accept that, that's on them. That's their policies and procedures on accepting another training. However, I strongly encourage you to review that department's said policies and procedures on exposures, what the exposure control plan is, so you can protect yourself as well there as we provide the protection here. So to start off with the overview of bloodborne pathogens, obviously it involves blood, human blood. You also have human blood components, whether it be your bone marrow, plasma, or whatnot, things that are deep inside the body, in the blood. You're not just going to bump into somebody and get this transfer. With the blood concept, you also have the bloodborne pathogen, which is the pathogenic organism that are present in human blood and can also cause disease in humans. The more common forms of bloodborne pathogens that we deal with are your hepatitis, your B, C, and your HIV. We hear sometimes of hepatitis A. This is normally regarding cooking establishments and things you may see on the news, where if you ate at a certain facility during a certain time, you go to the health department, get a hepatitis shot. But in our line of work, typically you see these three, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV, referred to as your more common types of bloodborne pathogens. Along with the blood, you also could have bloodborne pathogens in your OPIMs, your other potentially infectious materials. And again, these materials are within the body. You're not going to bump up against somebody and do the automatic transfer from one person to another, and unless you have an open wound and you have that blood-to-blood transfer. So as you can see here, the examples, your semen, vaginal secretions, your body fluids, and all of these, the body fluids are around the lungs, around the spine, around the heart, things again that are within the body. Saliva in dental procedures, if blood is present, your body fluid where it's difficult to tell the difference. Obviously, any unfixed tissue or organ other than intact skin from a human, dead or alive, and sometimes we'll see that typically on motor vehicle accidents or traumas where you may have amputations or whatnot. And then you also have the HIV, hepatitis cultures and blood organs, tissues from animals infected. So how do we transmit bloodborne pathogens? It all goes back to the common means of how they get into your body. Breaking the skin, a cut, a burn, a lesion, etc. If you have a cut and you have a scab, the best thing to do is leave that scab in place. A scab is actually considered a protectant. Mucous membranes, your eyes, nose, mouth. We've actually had a couple exposures dealing with the eyes, and that's why we're pretty aggressive with our eye protection. Sexual contact and other modes. So typically you have your common ones of You got your injection, ingestion, absorption, those concepts of inhalation, those concepts of transmission. But remember, for bloodborne pathogens to transfer, it has to be a blood into blood type transfer. The risk of infection depends on several factors. The little poster here you see, losing this much blood won't kill you, receiving this much good, and it all depends. The pathogen involved, what was the type of exposure, what's the amount of virus that's in the infected blood, the amount of affected blood involving exposure. Where was post-exposure treatment taken? There's actually some post-exposure treatments available out there, and also some immunity processes. Do you have certain shots in place that are protecting you, your hepatitis B vaccine, so forth, so on. So to kind of give a quick review, hepatitis, this is inflammation of the liver. The liver does a filtering system in our body. The inflammation of the liver may be caused by viral infection, poisons, or the use of alcohol. There you see your types of viral hepatitis. More commonly we deal with, or your B, C, but here you see your A, B, C, D, E, G. Your outcomes range from acute flu-like illnesses, jaundice, or the yellowing of the skin, and that just typically comes from where the liver is not able to filter out the certain processes of the body, so therefore it shows up through the skin by yellowing of the skin. It's typically a later sign dealing with hepatitis. Extreme fatigue, nausea, to advanced hospitalization and death. Bloodborne hepatitis is your B, C, D, and G. Your human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, this is the virus that causes AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. AIDS obviously is a serious condition that affects the body's immune system and the body's natural ability to fight infection. The HIV virus can obviously lead to AIDS. A common cold can cause a person with HIV, to go into worse conditions and potentially die. So your common illnesses can be drastically affected by the HIV virus or HIV. If you compare the two, we ask often in class, which one's easier to contract, and by far the hepatitis can live outside the body for several days given the right circumstances and conditions or whatnot. HIV, pretty much as soon as it leaves the body, it's killed. It's very fragile outside the body. Just typical UV light and conditions outside the body do not make it a good place for HIV. Don't do too well outside the body. Here's some other bloodborne pathogens. Again, as I said before, we don't hear of all these a lot, typically dealing with the hepatitis and HIV. So along with the bloodborne pathogens, there are processes in place that help prevent or minimize our exposure to these, and one of them is the SHARPS, with engineered SHARPS injury protection. This is not quite a needleless system yet, but it has things in place that protect you from getting stuck. A non-needle sharp, or a needle with a built-in safety feature, so the paramedics starting that IV, they start the IV, hit a little trigger, for lack of better terms, on the needle, and it retracts that needle in, or more commonly to us, our blood sugar finger sticks. We prick somebody's finger with our little needles. As soon as we prick the finger, the needle retracts back into the plastic protective box, so therefore we don't have an open needle to be stuck by. There's also the needleless systems. This is the most direct method of preventing needle stick injuries, and a lot of times after you see those IVs started, a lot of the medication transfers now are done via a needleless system. It's a port type system where they'll hook a plastic piece into a port on the IV, without having to inject a needle. Now we're going to discuss the emphasis of the OSHA standard, the 1910-1030 standard, with bloodborne pathogens, and that is the Exposure Control Plan, or commonly referred to as ECP if you're looking at any documents or whatnot. With this plan, it's designed to eliminate or minimize employee exposure that contains how often exposures, the determination of how often exposures occur, the schedule and method of implementing exposure determination, standard practices, hepatitis B vaccine procedures, how we communicate those hazards, to training files, record retention, etc. And then procedures for evaluating circumstances surrounding an exposure incident, which we're going to discuss these. The concepts behind the ECP is it must be accessible to employees. Along with that, it has to be reviewed and updated annually or more often if changes occur. This is one of those policies we have that all of ours are reviewed annually, but even if there's no change, we have to note in the revision section, revised on XYZ date, no changes. This is one of those things that the North Carolina Department of Labor will look at in the event, God forbid, somebody gets exposed. They want to see the plan and when was it last updated. It also must be available to North Carolina OSHA or NIOSH representatives. As far as for our plan itself, it's in our SOG SOPs. It's in the Section 3, 003-03, Section 5. Section 5 is the ECP, the Exposure Control Plan. So if you want to take a minute or so and kind of pull it up, have it accessible to you, you can, or as you go through this presentation, it's pretty much our ECP put into a presentation aspect. Along with this plan, we have to show universal precautions. This is the approach to infection control, the overall approach. The concept behind this is pretty much treating everything as if it's known to be infectious. And we can't per se say, hey, Sally Q has HIV, but we can tell other people, hey, universal precautions. When you hear that terminology, it should send off some signals. We're going to treat everything as it's infected. A funny story I like to tell is I was doing patient care one evening, and this elderly lady was the patient. I was putting my gloves on, and had my gloves on, and she looked at me and she's like, "Young man, I don't have anything." And my response back to her in a joking way is like, "Yes, ma'am, but you don't know what I have." So she kind of joked about it a little bit, and but overall, we're going to protect ourselves with the assumption that everything is infectious. Then you got your labels and signs. This is your generic biohazard label. Typically, it's on a red or orange background with the letters and symbols contrasting color so it stands out. Then you've got your work practice controls, washing hands. Employers shall provide readily accessible hand washing facilities, obviously at each fire station, but we also provide on the apparatus, as it says in the next little bullet, when not feasible, appropriate antiseptic hand cleansers shall be provided. That's one of the reasons why we keep the hand sanitizers on the apparatus. And it's one of those things, if it gets low, runs out, simply request and we'll put more on it. The concept behind that is obviously on an EMS call or whatnot, you're not going to have hand washing facilities there on the scene, so you could simply use antiseptic hand wash, the hand cleaner, as soon as you take your gloves off, and then as soon as you get back to the station, you still need to wash your hands. So, along with your work practice controls is do not bend or break contaminated needles. Even with our prevention systems in place where these needles are tracked back into a protective sheath or whatnot, we still want to use caution on handling these needles. We don't want to just put them on the bench seat in the ambulance or a common place we've seen them as cardiac arrest. We're on on the floor. We don't want to put them in situations where they're going to get bent, broke, or whatnot, because even if they're in that protective sheath, if they're bent or broke, then we had that potential for a needle stick. With the needles, we want to place contaminated needles in a sharps container. Typically these are red in color, as you see one pictured there. Ours in our medical bag are red with a little flip top. Leak proof on the sides and bottom. They're also designed to be spill proof, so if these things are even in the open mode, if it falls over, as long as they're not filled above the fill line, they should be spill proof. A common practice for this is, if you've got the needle in your hand, is for you to place it in the sharps container, not necessarily passing it down person to person to person to put it in the sharps container. It's the person put it in the sharps container. That way we eliminate or reduce that possibility of them getting stuck by the needle, or you dropping the needle, or whatnot. Along with the other work practice controls, and using mechanical devices or one-handed techniques to recap or remove contaminated needles when necessary. What it's talking about here is the one-handed method. If you do have to put a cap back on, instead of picking the cap up in one hand and the needle in the other and putting your hands together, the preference is to, with the needle in one hand, with the needle tip, pick the cap up with the needle tip and do it so in that manner, so you don't have that potential for you sticking yourself. Obviously we want to prohibit eating, drinking, and smoking in areas on calls. Food and drink must not be kept in the same store, just potential infection material, which we don't necessarily store those materials here, but you may be exposed to some of those areas in some of the places we go to for calls. Performing all procedures involving blood or OPIM so as to minimize splash and splatter or droplet generation. And in this case here, if you've one thing that comes to my mind is which we don't use it a lot now, but I've actually seen it happen, was motor vehicle accidents and bring a helicopter in and you've got the rotor wash. And I've actually seen a case where rotor wash come down and caused a droplet generation of some blood area on the stretcher due to the rotor wash. But we want to perform these procedures where we minimize that. We don't want to splash blood around or spatter it. And to me it's obvious, but it's in the policy. We want to prohibit mouth piping and suction in the blood. The old movie style, somebody gets bit by a snake and you cutting their skin open and sucking the venom out. That is not a suggested practice for obvious reasons. Following the work practice controls, we want to talk about our PPE. We have specialized clothing or equipment that is worn by an employee. Generally, we have work uniforms, uniform pants, shirts, blouses. Now, the question come up, on EMS calls, and yes, you're allowed to wear shorts while on duty, but if you're going to EMS call, you have to put your bunker pants on. This was debated one day, okay, well, I've got to put bunker pants on if I'm wearing shorts, but why don't I have to put long sleeves on if I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt? Well, the mindset behind that is you're more likely to kneel down on an EMS call and potentially kneel down with shorts on into a substance, whether it be blood or whatnot, versus very rarely are you on your elbows on EMS calls. Now, if you had the potential for being on your elbows or your arms on an EMS call, we do provide the sleeves, the cover sleeves in the medical bags. We provide those in the PPE kit for your protection. We also provide other processes of PPE, from your suits, your Tyvek suits, face guard, your face shields, and safety glasses. As you see here, types of PPE: gloves, gowns, face shields, eye protection, mouthpieces, and resuscitation devices. With these levels of PPE, OSHA requires the employer to provide these appropriate PPE at no cost to the employee. we also must ensure that PPE is worn by the employees. So it's not Clayton Fire Department or the fire chief or me being hard to get along with about this, but OSHA specifically says that the employer must ensure the PPE is worn by employees. So that's why we have our general statement, gloves on, glasses on, with our safety glasses. So that's another thing we emphasize. Again, we've actually had a couple of exposures in the eyes. One was an injury, one was actually an exposure on a medical incident. So that's why we've gone out and actually provided safety glasses to each employee. And also, in the event something comes up and you misplace or something happens to your safety glasses, there's also other safety glasses available in the medical bags. Now, those that are available in the medical bags are not meant to be taken out and made your own. They're meant to be there in the event you don't have some, you forgot yours get damaged or whatnot. But we keep a stock on hand with the emphasis of keeping up with your safety glasses. Those are yours, assigned to you. And as a general rule, if you put gloves on, glasses go on. These PPE types of PPE must also be accessible and in appropriate sizes for employees at the work site. Along with the provisions, PPE must be cleaned, repaired, replaced, and disposed of by the employer. What we want to prevent here is you taking stuff home with you. We don't want you to take any contaminants home with you, which we're at the advantage here of, when you go on a call, you come back here to the fire station. Remove PPE from before leaving the work area. This especially is true if you have one of those gross contaminations where a lot of blood or whatnot, and you get grossly contaminated, where at that point you could dispose of your clothes, take your clothes off, and we have means, whether it be Tyvek suits or even the spare clothing we keep on the FS1 truck that is put on there initially for water rescue purposes, but we can also use it in the case where somebody needs to take their clothes, dispose of their clothes, or has contaminated clothing. We can at least put them in something while we get those clothes cleaned. It's also a good idea when you come to work to obviously have a change of clothes, not specifically for bloodborne pathogens, but for other calls or whatnot. But it could be used in the event you get exposed or your clothing gets contaminated. You have a change of clothes. With the hepatitis B vaccination, everybody is given this speech or this presentation during the orientation. But the hepatitis B vaccination and post-exposure evaluation, including prophylaxis, shall be available to employees at a reasonable time and place without cost. Again, we meet this by doing an orientation. Everybody's provided the bloodborne pathogen information and also provided means for getting the hepatitis B vaccination series. You can decline this by signing the declination form, and typically you can write on that form while you're declining. You don't have to, but say if you got it at your other workplace and you don't want to get it through here, that's fine. But you have that process. It has to be performed by or under the supervision of a licensed physician or healthcare professional. Our process here is we send the form, we send it to emergency services, Johnson County Emergency Services, to confirm that you're in good standing. We can get that form back, and we forward our personnel to the Johnson County Health Department, and the employee makes the appointments on getting the vaccination series. With this being said, the vaccination shall be made available after the employee has received required training. That's why during orientation we say, okay, here's bloodborne pathogens, here's how they hurt you, now go get the vaccination. So with that being said, we don't want to just send somebody to the health department to get vaccinated and not know what they're getting vaccinated for. OSHA, they defined as time frame within 10 days of initial assignment to all employees with occupational exposure. So for our firefighter personnel, that is, getting the orientation process, that is well within the time frame of occupational exposure. Now, if you do orientation on a Thursday and a person works that next week, like I said, we emphasize to the people in the orientation to get it as soon as possible, make the appointment, and move forward from there. The vaccine is no cost to you. Is, if you recall, it's a 3-shot series. You get 1 shot, you go back in a month, get another shot, and go back in 6 months, get another one, the last one. It's effective for 95% of adults, with post-vaccination tested for high-risk healthcare workers, which our area is not necessarily considered a high-risk area. The post-exposure treatment, if not vaccinated, so say you don't get vaccinated and you get exposed to hepatitis, there is a treatment out there, your immune globulin, and you can obviously begin the vaccination series. And as I said before, if you decline, you must sign the declination form. However, if you sign the declination form today or at orientation and you decide a week from then, a year from then, or 5 years, the vaccine can be made available at a later date if desired. So for exposure processes, there are post-exposure and follow-up procedures. The documentation of exposure routes and how exposure incident occurred. This could be done by simply using our forms. They're available at each fire station, either in the notebook areas kept in the office area or in our SOG file on FireManager or the R drive. You simply go to the Bloodborne Pathogen SOG, which is 003-03, and there's appendixes off of that has these forms: the supervisor report, the exposure report, and we actually have 2 exposure reports. We have a Town of Clayton exposure report and a fire department exposure report. Pretty much the same information, just asked in kind of a different format, but it explains how was the exposure, what the route was it, was it an absorption through the eyes, did it get injected through a needle, etc. Identification and documentation of the source individual's infectivity, if possible. We're going to talk about that here in a second when we go through the steps of post-exposure. Collecting and testing of employees' blood for hepatitis B and HIV. Employees' consent is required. What this is talking about here, so let's say firefighter gets exposed. The patient exposed them, we're going to ask them some questions, and that firefighter has the option of going and collecting their own blood for testing, which is strongly recommended, which I'll explain here in a second as far as that whole process. There's actually a time frame that the employee's blood can be held. If, say, they want to draw the blood but not necessarily test it, say they want to wait for the source individual's infectivity report to come back, there is a time frame that blood can be held. I want to say it's like 90 days. And then after this is said and done, there is post-exposure prophylaxis when medically indicated. Typically, if there is an exposure, an active exposure, an infected person infects an employee, there are some prophylaxis medications that can be used to combat the infectious, the bloodborne pathogen. There's counseling available as well for the employee and the family, and there's also an evaluation of reported illnesses. So this whole process is in place. The exposed employee, again, exposed employee's blood shall be collected as soon as feasible after consent is obtained. Again, the exposed employee have to give consent to get their blood. If the employee consents to baseline blood collection but not HIV, the sample can be preserved for 90 days. So if they want to go to baseline collection, that's fine, but they say they want to do HIV testing, they can hold that blood for 90 days. So let's say the person that exposed them comes back HIV positive, then they can then choose to go and say, okay, I want my blood tested. Now keep in mind with HIV, if a person gets exposed today and they go immediately to the hospital and have their blood drawn, if their blood comes back HIV positive, they already had the virus, because there is a few days of incubation that takes place for it to show up. There's a process of that testing with time frames. With the exposure procedures, in the event of an exposure, who is contacted? For us, immediately after an exposure is done, the on-duty captain, the shift supervisor that's on that day at that station, needs to be contacted, and then at that point contact is made with fire department admin. Typically we'll start with myself, and if I'm out of place, the fire chief or Tony. If we're out of place, Jeffra can also be contacted as well. And a lot of times Jeffra's going to be involved anyway, dealing with an exposure, because we're also looking at potential workers' comp claims with that. What actions are required to take place? Form completion, information gathering. Again, like I said earlier, the forms are available at each fire station, and also if you're not at the fire station, say you're out on a call, you want to start gathering some of this information, you can actually go to a laptop or electronic device with internet, access FireManager, go to the library, go to SOG files, and all of our SOGs, including the forms, are there. Even if you can't print it off, you can at least see the information that is needed to be gathered for transferring that information to a form. Shared information with applicable personnel must be and is required to remain confidential. So during this whole investigation, as you're obtaining information from, say, the source individual and the employee, this information is protected. We typically will, just like any patient care report, we safeguard this information dealing with the exposure processes and history or whatnot. With information and training with the Bloodborne Pathogen Standard, pretty much states pretty simply, training shall be provided at the time of initial assignment to tasks where occupational exposures may occur, and at least annually thereafter, which is why we do what we do. With the orientation training, we provide the training for bloodborne pathogens. We allow the start of the vaccination series, and at that point, the annual training from distance learning or other needed processes. Along with the training concepts and understanding our process we do with documentation and notification, this is the step-by-step bloodborne exposure steps, and this is actually available in our SOP file, and it explains each step as the exposure happens. The on-duty captain is notified. They notify admin, safety officer. Typically it starts with me or Tony, and then the steps go from there. The notification is made with the emergency room charge nurse or physician to which the source patient's being transported to, and conversing with the physician, we explain to them, hey, patient John Doe's being transported there from a certain incident. During this incident, the patient exposed firefighter Smith to bloodborne pathogen by blood getting in his eyes or whatever the case may be. The physician deems it is a true exposure, and at that point, when the patient arrives, they can get verbal consent from the source patient. They don't have to. It's not required, but it is somewhat desirable, at least letting them know, hey, look, we're going to run a bloodborne pathogen blood draw on you since you exposed a firefighter, and it's already going to be done anyway. The blood's already going to be done. The blood draws are already going to be done for the lab, so it's more of just a courtesy, letting them know what's going on. At that time, the exposure is reported to the on-call infection preventionist. Information needed there: exposed agents, the exposed person, agency name, the name and title of agency contact, number of contact, the phone number for the contact person, and the phone number for the exposed person. Notifications made to exposed person of lab results. Typically what has happened in the past is when the labs come back, the person will contact the agency contact person or supervisor. They will confirm, hey, I've got a contact number for so-and-so, the exposed person is this. You say yes, and it's okay. I'm going to call and let him know that everything is okay, or further testing is needed, or whatnot. If it comes back as an issue, we've got a couple options. You see here the medical management of exposed person. This is a responsibility of his or her employer. So that's why that information is shared to the supervisor, typically fire department admin, contact person, on the results of the test. If it's a hepatitis B or hepatitis C exposure, it does not require emergency testing. It typically can wait to a business hours or whatnot if it's after hours. If it comes back as a HIV positive, or if it's a true exposure of known HIV status. If it's after hours, treatment can begin in the ER. If the source is known HIV patient or severe exposure, enough meds can be given until the exposed person can be seen by his or her employee health program provider. So with this being said, and we've emphasized this in the past, if you get exposed, it's very important that you report that exposure right away. Because with this person, with the source patient, at the hospital, it's very easy to get these steps done. If you wait till the next day, and say exposure happens 2 o'clock in the morning, you say, well, I'm not going to bother, admin about this. They can wait till the morning. If you tell us about it in the morning, we call the hospital, and that person is gone, it's going to take a process to find this person, track them down, bring them to the hospital, which all has to be done through like a subpoena type system. You can't just go to his house, knock on his door. It has to be done with the assistance of law enforcement to essentially take custody of them temporarily to get this blood draw done. So that's why it's very important. If you get exposed, immediately report it, and so we can get these steps going. Now, along with the testing, how it's done is HIV. Real quick synopsis of it is if the source person has HIV, or say the exposed employee, so you get your blood drawn, and you right away you want to get HIV testing done. If you draw your blood and the next day it comes back HIV positive, that person already had HIV. The exposure did not give them the HIV, because it takes a couple weeks or so to HIV to incubate in the body and to develop. But let's say the blood comes back as negative HIV, so they're going to say, all right, come back in 6 weeks, do another test. If that test comes back HIV positive, then the exposure caused the HIV status. If it comes back negative, they're going to say, okay, come back in 12 weeks. If that exposure comes back positive, then again that exposure caused the HIV status. If it comes back negative, chances are that they will always be negative, because there's been enough time period there for the virus to incubate in the body and quote-unquote show itself. Even after that, though, there's still another 6-month checkup done, follow-up done, just to confirm everything for that process. And then closing it out, the training program elements is pretty much, if you read this list, it goes over everything we've gone over. And then with any training, we have record keeping. Our medical records are kept confidential in a medical file. This does contain some sensitive information based on personnel names, social security numbers, hepatitis B vaccination stuff, information provided to a healthcare provider as required if you have an exposure. And the other key to this, we must maintain these records for the length of employment plus 30 years. So this is definitely one of those with our retaining schedule of paperwork. This is by far one of the longest. Training records itself, obviously training dates, training session content and summary, names and qualification of trainers, and job titles of all the trainees. This is one reason why we do use the FireManager test system. We have in that, when you log in, do the test, even if you're doing it as a group, we've got the names of people there. We can correlate the names to your title, and we have to maintain those trainer records for at least 3 years, which overall, minimally, our retention schedule for training records, the hard copies, in-house is 5 years, so we actually exceed the 3-year requirement for OSHA purposes. So that wraps up the lesson plan for the most part. Now let's look at this case study real quick. The motor vehicle accident where the firefighter got his hand cut on the windshield. The first question is this considered a bloodborne exposure? The answer to that would be yes, if the area of the windshield that cut the firefighter had blood or OPIMs present. In the case where this happened, they treated it as an exposure, informed the hospital they agreed it was a potential exposure, so they did the workup. What immediate actions need to take place? obviously provide first aid for the firefighter. We're going to thoroughly wash the area with soap and water. We're going to obtain patient information, their name, medical history. We can ask the patient, do you have any known medical history, seizures, diabetes, any diseases or whatnot. We can ask that through our regular medical history process. And then, where are you transporting to? Where are they transporting this patient? What hospital are they going to? What contact needs to be made? We mentioned that Department Safety Officer receiving facility for source testing, as we mentioned during the step-by-step process. And what documentation needs to be made? Again, we've got our exposure forms that are available to us at the stations or via FireManager. But also remember to note on the NIFRS report, the fire report, of the injury in the firefighter/civilian injury section. Definitely need to note that. We don't need to note personal names in the fire report, but we can note in the narrative, one firefighter exposed on incident C, fire department admin for paperwork and details. And then, what are some recommended actions to prevent this from happening again? We can consider handling the windshield in an area not contaminated with blood or OPIMs. Instead of totally removing it, as they did, they physically picked his windshield up, moved it away from the car, carried it. Actually, I think they carried it to the other side of the ditch bank and put it down. But they could have just simply folded it down instead of picking it up and handling it in the manner they did. Alright, that wraps up the Bloodborne Pathogens section of the training topic. And we're going to move right on into the Hazard Communication Standard, or HazComm. This is also known as your right to know, and there is a OSHA standard with it as well. It is the 1910-1200. It states that companies producing and using hazard materials must provide employees with information and training on the proper handling and use of these materials. Overall, the purpose is to ensure that all the hazards of all chemicals produced or imported are evaluated, and the information concerning their hazard is transmitted to the employers and employees. The purpose of this transmittal is via a program to which personnel are warned about certain things, your safety data sheets, the training for overall protection of our employees. The key elements is inventory or materials inventory. It's a list of hazard materials in your work area. Your safety data sheets is a detailed description of each hazard material listed in the materials inventory. Each station has this inventory, which we'll talk about where they're at here in a few minutes. This is an OSHA update, the change from MSDS to SDS. This update actually took place a couple years ago, but it's still a common, MSDS still being thrown out, so I just kind of kept that in there as a reminder. The terminology now is safety data sheets versus material safety data sheets. Labeling, the containers of hazardous materials must have labels on them. And there is an OSHA update with labels, and a pictogram has been included in this presentation and in our SOP. And I think there's actually even a few questions dealing with what the pictures look like, what they represent. So you'll have to refer back to that pictogram. Training, all employees must be trained to identify and work safely with hazard materials, and the written program. And again, our policy procedures do cover this in our SOP listing. So what do you need to know? This being the Right to Know Act, what do you need to know? You need to know how these materials can hurt you, how you can protect yourself, and also where can you find the answers for the first two questions. But the first part of this, we want to recognize what our hazards are. The first step in using chemicals safely is to recognize materials that may be hazardous to your health. And this is done prior to, not during the use or only if you get hurt or exposed by something, but you need to do this prior to using these materials. Recognize these hazards. We're going to look for warning labels, NFPA placards, the 704 placard, which we'll go in detail here in a second, and recognize keywords. A lot of these labels are pretty easy to understand. They stand out at you. As you can see here, here's the OSHA label update. This is also available in your SOP listing, and as I said earlier, there are a few test questions that you may have to refer back to this, but you've got the flaming O oxidizers, you've got your flame for your flammables, your exploding bomb for your explosive self-reactives, your skull and crossbones. This is your acute toxicity or severe. This is typically associated with death. Skull and crossbones are pretty bad. Your corrosion symbol there for corrosives, and then the cylinder symbol, the pictogram there with the person's upper body with the heart area, health hazards, carcinogens, respiratory sensitive materials, your target organ toxicity. Then you've got your environmental toxicity, and then your exclamation mark is for your irritants, dermal sensitive, acute toxicity, narcotic effects, etc. Commercial labels. When we buy products, it comes obviously in a label, in a container with a label. OSHA requires this. Certain information on these: the product name, a warning statement, message, or symbol, and the manufacturer's name and address. Some will also list safe handling procedures in addition to this. Even some of our products we have also come with their own MSDS, or correction, SDS sheet. When products are stored in a container other than an original container, they must also provide information such as your product name, the purpose of it, what the hazards are, and your first aid procedures. So this is one thing that often is caught during our monthly safety or fire station safety inspections, but you don't have to wait for that monthly safety inspection. If you see a container, typically these are your spray bottles that we transfer the product from the original container to a spray bottle. These things have to have labels on them. If it's found without a label, you can contact the project manager for this. At the current time, the project manager is Captain Kevin Stansel. He's responsible for it, but as we go on, it's likely that project may be passed on to another captain. But overall, the container has to have a label. If it doesn't, you can contact them, and a correction can be made, a label can be put on, and correct that issue. So obviously here's some of your commercial labels. As I said earlier, you got your words. You see caution standing out at you. You got your warning for the outdoor electrical things, and you got your containers in your typical kitchen or bathroom cleanup. Here's your keywords, recognizing keywords. As you read labels, look for keywords which signal that you should take extra care. There's your skull and crossbones. Again, severe, danger, caution, and serious risk. These are those words that should alarm you, and these I would say are probably in a worse case scenario to least hazard. You've got your skull and crossbones also being your worst, danger, caution, and serious risk. Then toxicity is also used in the aspect of how bad something can be to a person's health. Sometimes you could have an acute toxicity, meaning a little bit of something can be very bad, as you see with the skull and crossbones, or you can have like a chronic, like an overtime toxicity buildup, or overtime chronic injury illness. Here's your NFPA 704 placard. This is a method of identifying certain hazards, and you can see how it's broken down here. The red is associated with fire hazards and flash points. The higher the number, the worse the hazard. So with red, fire hazard, 4 is flammable, below 73 Fahrenheit. Then 3 is below 100 degrees. 2 is your below 200. 1 is above 200, and 0 will not burn. So these are your flash points when you're dealing with these certain temperatures. Blue is your health hazard. 4 being deadly, 3 being extreme danger, 2 being hazardous, 1 slightly hazardous, and 0 is no health threat. Across the placard to the yellow is your reactivity hazard. This is 4 is may detonate, 3 shock or heat may detonate it, 2 violent chemical reaction, like water reactive, and number 1 is unstable if heated. 0 is stable. White, this is kind of a catch-all or a specific hazard. You could have various things shown here. A W with a line through it is water reactivity. So if you see a 4 or say a 2 in yellow, and this obviously you're dealing with a reactive substance to water. Oxidizers, OX, acid is your ACD, corrosive. I've also seen sometimes you may see like a radiological, like a radiation type symbol being used in there. Just depends on what your hazard is. If you're unsure of this as well, you can also use our Hazmat Wiser program. Our Hazmat Wiser program has a module in it where you can go to the 704 placard. You can punch in the numbers and symbols that you may see in the placard, and the Wiser program will give you a list of potential products that you may be dealing with. Physical hazard defined, obviously substances that threaten your physical safety. Fire, explosion, chemical reactivity, or all can be that. You got your flammables. This is your materials that use the fire symbol. Flammables, gas, liquid, solids that ignite easily or burn rapidly, flash points under 100 degrees. And you got your combustibles. These do not ignite easily as flammables. Flash point is above 100. So the easy example here, gasoline's flammable, diesel fuel is combustible. Then you've got your pyrophoric, spontaneous combustion. Materials burst into flame on their own. The explosive symbol is materials which release a tremendous amount of energy in the form of heat, light, or expanding pressure. Water reactives react with water, may explode or release gas that is flammable. Unstable reactives, chemicals that can react or become self-reactive when subject to shock, pressure, or temperature. Organic peroxides contains oxidizers and acts as a powerful oxidizer, which takes us to the flaming O. These are your oxidizers, other substances to burn more easily if you have oxidizers. I think during fire behavior we show a pretty good example of taking the little glass with the oxygen being fed into the candle and how that candle gets brighter. It makes things burn easier. The cylinder symbol is pretty much used for bottle under great pressure. Typically you'll see these on like the oxygen truck when it comes and delivers oxygen. You'll see this placard on it. Nitrogen, oxygen, and saline. Our saline bottles or oxygen bottles would all meet this particular requirement. So this takes us to our safety data sheets. As I mentioned before, OSHA updated the title of this, SDS from MSDS to SDS. So while labels are effective means to alert you, there are other times you need more detailed information. Pretty much how you can protect yourself and what do you do if you are exposed. Here's the various information contained in the SDS. You can read them verbatim here, but pretty much what it is, your target, what's it going to target organ, what's it going to affect most, your health hazards, all your limits, how to handle it, what PPE do you need, emergency first aid procedures, special instructions, etc. The biggest key point with these SDSs is you need to be aware of these prior to using the product. Don't say to yourself, well, I'm going to go use this nitric acid prior to reading the SDS on it. Because in the event you're using nitric acid, and say you get nitric acid in your eyes, now you may not be able to read that SDS to see what you need to do to handle this or take care of yourself, etc. So obviously if you're getting ready to use a product and you see the label on it and it's got skull and crossbones or toxic or whatever, if you're not familiar with that product and what it is or what it can do to you, go to the SDS book, look it up, read the procedures. If you go to the SDS book and there's not an SDS, we definitely, admin needs to be contacted immediately for that and find out where the issue there is. But that project's pretty well managed, and like I said, we should be pretty well up to date with our products there. Here's another example of that. Chemicals such as sodium hydroxide are very dangerous. If you have an accident, you may not have time to look it up. You should read it prior to you actually using it. So where are SDSs located? The HazComm standard states the SDS information shall be accessible to all employees. We can't keep it under lock and key. We can't keep it, in a certain area where only certain people have access to, but all employees have to have access. So this is one of those questions too. When the North Carolina Department of Labor comes by and does site inspections, this is one question they're pretty much guaranteed to ask, and they'll ask anybody. The person walking in the hall, hey, you work here? Sure. Hey, where's your SDSs located? We should know this, and for that, we actually keep them in a specific area at each station. They're not moved. Station 1 day room has a book, and Station 2 in the office area. These are labeled, not to be removed. If you need information out of it, you're welcome to get it, but we need to keep the books in place. Be familiar with them and the information provided. In the book itself, I strongly encourage you, as you're looking at this, if you want to take a break, go get the book and look at it. But it's got a table of contents, so you can kind of go through and see what you're dealing with, what kind of product it is, and use that as an example. Again, take time to read them before using chemicals. There's your other example. If you're using chemical X and it burns your hands or eyes, you may not be able to read or even handle the book to read what you need to do. And as a reminder, knowing where SDSs are located and how to use them is your responsibility. It is part of your job. As an employer, we have to provide this information to you, but as an employee, it's your responsibility to know how to protect yourself. Some protective measures we have in place. So not only do we have to inform you what they are or how to protect yourself, but we also have other protective measures in place that safeguard your health and physical safety. Product substitution, engineer control, safe work practices, all these are examples. This is probably one of the most common issues that places deal with, not specifically here at the fire station, but it actually has been a few times where this has come up. But if somebody sees product X, this can clean this, or product Y is super concentrated and can do a better job at it. Well, it may. However, there are other concepts to look at. How toxic it is. We may choose to use something that may not be as good a cleaner, but is less toxic, so it's safeguarding our people. Safe work practices will ensure that chemicals are used correctly and safely. And PPE, we provide them, so please use them. Everything from gloves to your safety glasses, ear protection, all that kind of good stuff. And in material inventory, monitor chemicals in your workplace. Purchasing can monitor existing chemicals and newly purchased chemicals to ensure SDSs are acquired. And this is one of those things we really harp on. We don't just send, if we send somebody to the store, we be very specific. You need to get this. Typically, the reason for that is we already have an SDS on file. An example there was when we baby powder. We had to get some new baby powder for the dry suits. We had one version. The other version, the actual original version of our baby powder, we didn't have the right SDS for it, so we had to update that to make sure we had the right information for that particular product. We also will replace outdated SDS with currents, and again, this is part of the project manager, and seek alternative, less hazardous chemicals that will do the same job as we mentioned earlier. And just as a reminder here, only approved personnel are allowed to purchase chemicals or cleaning supplies, and do not store personal cleaning supplies like your Armor All or bathroom cleaner, etc., at either fire station. Oftentimes we'll have people come bring their cars up here, wash your cars or whatnot. And you want to bring your own cleaning supplies, that's one thing. but you need to take them home with you. You don't need to store them here at the firehouse. For administration and supervisors, ensure all employees are trained if new chemicals are introduced in the workplace, and again, that's just handled through processes of purchasing and using chemicals, and enforce proper PPE to be used while chemicals are being used. This is one of those things we don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but one question is always asked: if you get exposed while using a chemical or on a scene or whatnot, one of the first questions we ask is, were you using the right PPE? And not using the right PPE can cause for other processes to take place for control of or enforcement of that process. And employees, know the hazards associated with each chemical you're working with, know how to protect yourself, and know how to handle an emergency. Read the labels and know the SDS of all chemicals you're working with. And that pretty much wraps up the Bloodborne Pathogen and HazComm standard. Again, it was a good refresher. It's information you've already heard over the last several years, but putting in this format here should be easier to communicate things instead of just reading a slide. One part of this training per OSHA says annual training can be delivered via distance learning as long as specific agency requirements are covered. Again, we've done that through the Bloodborne Pathogen and HazComm. Also, the question session is key here. OSHA says you can do distance learning as long as questions pertaining to the training can be directed to a specific person for immediate response. So for that clarification, if you have any questions, you can contact myself. You see my cell phone, 919-201-4505. My direct office line is 919-359-9367. Again, that's directly to my office. You don't have to go through either Miss Gail. That rings directly to my office. Or if it's not necessarily a big pressing question, you want to email it to me, you've got my email there as well, jdean@townofclaytonnc.org. Alright, to conclude this training session, we need to have a training verification. And how we're going to verify this training session is, as we have in the past, you can simply go to the sign on the FireManager, go to the Forms tab, and you'll see the current year listed Bloodborne Pathogen HazComm training form. Simply open that form and complete it, answer the various questions there, and submit it. The person that's logged in the FireManager, the submitter, when they submit, when it's received and modified, they will also receive notification back that, hey, it's being reviewed. With that form, you can put multiple people, and you'll see the little tab that at the top where you have to acknowledge you reviewed the presentation, and you can list the personnel. And at that point, I take that list and I enter it into Firehouse for training report verification. So the number of hours, we're doing 1.5 hours. This presentation is right at an hour long, and plus that should give you a good 20-30 minutes to finalize the test process. The due date for this is the end of April. So by the end of April, so that should give plenty of time, over a month for personnel work shift schedules to do that. Sooner the better, but definitely no later than April 30th. And as usual, if you have any questions or any follow-ups are needed, feel free to contact Fire Department Admin. And thank you for joining us for this distance learning training session. Have a good day.